It's now been a couple of weeks since I posted anything to the Facebook page, the YouTube page, from my ministry report and my ministry aspect. The reason being that last week was the week of Thanksgiving. Now I know Thanksgiving just constitutes one day, but other stuff happened during the week. My mom and her boyfriend, my mom is 89, her boyfriend is 10 years younger. He has to be in order to keep up with her. Actually came and paid us a visit. And it was a challenge for her. He's diabetic, has issues, and so they decided to come, and they boarded the plane and showed up a week ago Sunday. And spent a couple of days with us, put him on the plane Tuesday afternoon. Many of you saw the post on my Facebook page about me taking her for a motorcycle ride. And so that constituted Monday and Tuesday. Well, then Wednesday was the day that I took Sarah to the hospital for pre-op for her kidney stone removal the following week. So that took a big bite out of Wednesday. And then there was a ramping up for Thursday, and Thursday was Thanksgiving Day. And then by the time I got to Friday, the week was pretty well spent. And I thought, it is what it is. We're just going to let it go for a week, and we'll pick up this week. And the truth of the matter was that I received a text on Friday from a local small Baptist church asking me if I would fill in. They've been without a pastor for over a year. Another friend of mine had been serving there as interim, and he got sick. And so he reached out to the director of missions, who reached out to me and said, would you take this? And unless I have a conflict, I'm not going to turn an opportunity down. But that provides something of the backdrop to what I want to deal with today, that I really do want some input from those of you who log on and who watch and listen to what we do. It just so happens on Thursday morning I got a text from a friend of mine, a pastor of a church on James Island, the Fort Johnson Baptist Church. He was out of town. His student pastor was supposed to fill in for him. His student pastor got sick. And so he wanted to know if I would fill in for him. I got to tell you, it was tough because this is a church that I've been familiar with. I've visited before. I've never had an opportunity to preach at. But because of his kindness and our growing relationship and friendship, he reached out to me. And it was tough, but I had to let him know that his youth guy needed to plan his illnesses, schedule them better, because I was already committed and needed to keep that obligation. So last Sunday morning, we went to this small church. Here is what it looks like. You would think it's sitting in the country, but it's not. It's very much in city. Matter of fact, it's just right down the road, very close proximity, probably a half a mile at most, from a new $200 million mixed-use facility that's going into Summerville. It's going to have housing there, place for people to live, and businesses. It's going to be one of those sort of hubs where people can live and actually walk to wherever they want to go, restaurants and shops and other kind of things. So it's in a great location in proximity to opportunity, but it sits in the middle of opportunity. Been around for, I understand, about 70 years. Maybe a little bit longer than I have. And so my quandary was, and I'm going to read a text to sort of create the framework for this, and then I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I really would like to get a response from some of you. So I was thinking about, already been thinking about the next opportunity was I'm supposed to be preaching just up the road from that church, another church that I spent a couple of weeks at that's been without a pastor for 6 years now. And I was already thinking about the text and the framework for that church. And so I went there in preparation for last Sunday. And I wanted to deal with the issue of Saul, the king of Israel, who started out on a good foot and ended up on a really bad foot. And there are a couple of scenes in Kings that are very famous scenes where he is responsible for leading Israel in war against their enemy, in this case, the Philistines. In the first case, he was sitting under a pomegranate tree doing nothing. He was surrounded, he was outnumbered and doing nothing. And his son, who was probably just an older adolescent, wasn't afraid of anything. He believed that God could do anything. There are only two swords that anybody in the kingdom had, he and his dad. But the young man took his armor bearer and said, hey, let's go give it a shot. And he had decided on a plan to know whether God was in it or not. Go back and read the account in 1 Kings. And it worked out just fine. While the king was doing nothing, sitting under a pomegranate tree, his son essentially initiated a victory for Israel against all odds. Fast forward a couple of chapters, not too far in the storyline, and you have the account of what David and Goliath. David's a shepherd boy that the king found out he was a musician, and he came to play music when the king got all out of sorts, when Saul got out of sorts. And we know that story, that Goliath came along, the Philistines came along, and there was a throwdown in the valley, and Saul, it doesn't say he was sitting on a pomegranate tree, but he was sitting someplace else not doing anything. And Goliath says, send your best, and we'll duke it out here in the valley, and the winner takes all. And nobody was willing to do it because Goliath was a really big boy. And then David, was sent to town by his dad to bring food to his brothers who were serving in Saul's army. I'm not sure doing what, since evidently there was no fighting going on. And so David, as another young man, probably an older adolescent, who came, and while he was there, he witnessed this scene of Goliath, and Goliath taunting Israel, and Goliath blaspheming Israel's God. And David's like, why didn't anybody do anything? And he said, I'll do it. Well, his brothers got all over him and said, you just came to see some blood here. What are you doing? Who's looking after the sheep? David ignored him, and he kept asking the question. Ending up, he went to the king, because it was told anybody who would step forward and do this, he would get the hand of the king's daughter in marriage. So evidently David was old enough to consider getting married. And I'm not sure that was his driving motivation, but it was certainly in the back of his mind. So he went to Saul and says, hey, don't worry, I've got this. I'm not much, I'm a shepherd boy, but I've got this. I've seen what I can do against all odds. And anyway, I'm not going to go into the story and give it away, but that was all the framework, because I was thinking about this idea within the context of these churches. I've admitted to you before that my sense of calling in this season of life has been to come alongside of struggling churches, those that are dead or those that are dying or close to it, and to have the conversation with them about what they might need to do in order to avoid death. Now, I've not had a lot of opportunities, but I've had a few, and they have been relatively interesting experiences. I've gone, I've presented, I've felt reasonably assured that I was clear, that I was saying what was true, what the Lord would have me to say to those places, and even offering my services to come alongside of them, and they have, by and large, been churches without pastors or looking for pastors, and they're all struggling to find somebody. Number one, most of them can't afford anybody, pay a living wage, and then their circumstances doesn't inspire most ambitious young men to go in there and try to do something, and so these churches are struggling. And my thoughts have been, I've been around a long time, been doing this a long time, across the state and in the country in a couple of different states, and my track record seems to be relatively proven by church standards. I've pastored rural churches that grew. I've pastored small town churches that grew. I've pastored suburban churches that grew. I've planted a church that had phenomenal growth, and so over the decades of ministry, I've ministered and served in so many different places that were a different setting with one single passion, and that was to make Christ known and then to disciple those who responded. And so my thinking is I bring something to the table that I offer to these churches by way of walking with them, helping them deal with the questions they need to be asking and confronting what the real issues are. For those of you who may not be aware, but an intentional or a transitional interim, that's sort of like the long-term substitute in a church. His purpose is to help them deal with tough stuff so they can get mad at him and then get over it, so that they can resolve the issues and the conflicts that need to be resolved. So when a new pastor does come, he doesn't have to fight to do anything. They'll say, we're ready, just lead us, and we will go there. I've seen this happen. I've been a part of this process before. And so my hope is that these churches would, really without any strings attached, because they can always tell me to take a hike at any point, would be at least willing to have those kind of conversations. And statistically, it's a low percentage return. Preaching at these churches, say, anything I can do for you, let me know. Let's have the conversation. And then, I don't get a return call. A church that I preached at last year, it's been well over a year now. Somebody contacted me and said, hey, are you still available? And we haven't found anybody. Can you come? I said, certainly. They said, well, I'll get back to you. Well, that's been 6 weeks ago, and I haven't heard anything. And so in preparation for last Sunday to go into this church, I found myself in a struggle. So I'm going to go ahead and read a text that sort of frames our issue today as I work through a set of questions that I really would like to have a response from you, either on Facebook, contact me on email, or through YouTube. There are places for you to make comments there. So out of 1 Kings chapter 22, this is what we read. 3 years passed without war between Aram and Israel. In the third year, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came down to the king of Israel. Now the king of Israel said to his servants, do you know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us? And we're still doing nothing to take it out of the hand of the king of Aram. And he said to Jehoshaphat, will you go with me to battle in Ramoth-Gilead? And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. Moreover, verse 5, Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, please inquire first for the word of the Lord. Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said to them, shall I go against Ramoth-Gilead to battle, or shall I refrain? And they said, go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. But Jehoshaphat said, is there not yet a prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of him? The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah. All right, enough of the story, sort of the setup there. This is a part of Israel's history where the kingdom is divided between Judah and Israel. Jehoshaphat happens to be the king of Judah. Ahab happens to be the king of Israel. Ahab was an idolater. His wife was Jezebel, perhaps the most wicked woman in all of the Scripture. And he essentially did what his wife wanted him to do. Jehoshaphat, on the other hand, was a man who had a heart similar to David's heart. And he really was interested in what the Lord had to say. But they had they'd come together in agreement not to fight with each other and to create this alliance because they shared common enemies. Why compete? And the alliance had led to a marriage between the son of Jehoshaphat and the daughter of Ahab. And that was sort of how they maintained peace, kept them together. Well, then Ahab came up against Aram, the Arameans, and they were really more than he was willing to tackle on his own. And so he reached out to this in-law, the father-in-law of his daughter, and said, hey, this is a common enemy. My friends are your friends, my enemies are your enemies, and vice versa. Will you go with me to fight this battle? And Jehoshaphat said, well, certainly. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. And, at one point, one hand will wash the other. And but then Jehoshaphat said, don't you think we ought to inquire of the Lord? Have the prophets tell us what we ought to do. And so Ahab, he called 400 of his lackeys, because that's essentially what they were. And they all came and they said, it's yours, boss. It's yours for the taking. Go and, best wishes. You're going to come back victorious. Now, Jehoshaphat, while he had his faults, he was certainly savvy enough to know that when he talked about hearing from the Lord, and when Ahab talked about hearing from the Lord, they were not talking about the same Lord, even though they used a common language. And what is lost in translation here, when Micaiah is described as a prophet of the Lord. Now that word Lord is not a title, that's actually a name for God, a name for Jehovah God. And so that references a clear recognition that Micaiah is somebody who speaks on behalf of Jehovah God. And so Jehoshaphat said, can we hear from him? And Ahab says, well, we can, but just let me tell you in advance. He's never prophesied any good to me. And so my solution is just don't hear him. Don't hear him. Jehoshaphat says, well, let me be the judge of that, since I'm going to be entering into this bloodbath with you. And that's where we have the story. And so Micaiah comes, and we don't know what the exact scene is, but we know that he's there. I'm guessing that they're surrounded by this crowd of 400 prophets of Baal. Micaiah looks around, and he knows the story. He knows the gig. He's been around the block a few times. He's had these experiences with Ahab in the past. And so when he's asked, what do we go up against the Arameans? Now, what's not recorded in Scripture here is any body language, any facial expressions, any timing of the speech or the words or the language he uses, other than Micaiah says, yeah, go do what you want to do. It's okay. Now, you would think that Ahab would have been all over that. Good. Enough. Jehoshaphat, you satisfied? Everybody, including the guy that I don't like, has said, go do it. Don't know whether it was just he was rubbed raw in that moment because he felt like Micaiah was being sarcastic. And sarcasm against the king just is more than he can bear. Rather than just let it slide, he couldn't let it slide. He said, come on, Micaiah. When have you ever told me what I wanted to hear? I'm a big boy. I can take it. Tell me. The king said to him, how many times must I adjure you? This is verse 16. To speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord. There's that name again. So he said, I saw Israel scattered on the mountains, like sheep which have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let each man return to his house in peace. Then the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? Then in verse 29, so the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up against Ramoth Gilead. Got to be some politics involved in here. Jehoshaphat asked for a dissenting voice among all the prophets. He got what he asked for. He got the voice of somebody who had a track record. He had a reputation with Ahab to never saying anything that Ahab wanted to hear. And yet he was willing to go with him into battle over this warning from Micaiah. If you read the story, you know what happens. Micaiah was true. It was not a positive experience. As a matter of fact, it was the experience in which one of my more intriguing passages of Scripture take place, where Ahab actually lost his life. And he lost his life not through the accuracy of someone, but through the chance. They're in battle. As a matter of fact, Ahab, he was such a hypocrite. He doesn't believe Micaiah. He makes fun of Micaiah. He slams him as being contrarian. And yet when he goes into battle, he said, Jehoshaphat, you wear your king's suit. I'm not going to dress up for the battle. Thinking to himself, well, you know what? I'm going to hedge my bets. Just on the outside chance that Micaiah really does know that this is not going to go down well, I'm going to at least guard my personal assets. I'm going to be unrecognizable as the king of Israel. They're going to identify the generals. They're certainly going to identify Jehoshaphat. And so if the enemy sort of gains the advantage in the battle, that's who they're going to go after. I'll sort of lead in secret. And the account says that an archer at a venture drew his bow and shot an arrow. And that arrow found a chink in the armor of Ahab. And it was a mortal, fatal blow. He didn't die instantly. He told his chariot driver to take and get me out of here. And Jehoshaphat lost the battle too. The Arameans were victorious. So all that is in the back of my mind is I'm working through these processes. Now, you know, admittedly, my preaching, my style, and my content to some degree has evolved over the almost 50 years that I've been preaching. I want to think that I'm better at it now than I was 48 years ago. That's for somebody else to judge. I think my wife would say that is an accurate statement, but then that's not saying a whole lot because I was really bad, you know, almost 50 years ago. And I know that I spent almost a quarter of a century. That's one way to say it was really a long time. Having planted a church and then having preached to people that we effectively reached, those that wouldn't be found dead in anybody else's church. And so I had refined my method and my content, all those things, to deal with people that needed to hear the gospel and then needed to be shepherded or discipled in becoming like Jesus once they had stepped across that threshold. And I think the record speaks that what we did was very effective. So I had that comfort level. It was familiar. The people knew me. They knew what to expect. They knew my twisted sense of humor. They knew all those things about me. And so it made this bilateral relationship and communication when I preached very easy and comfortable for me. And people knew what to expect. And it was a very much a symbiotic relationship. Leave that in retirement, come to South Carolina, where I'm trying to engage churches that didn't fit that profile. These churches here, while they may have been birthed to reach unchurched people, many of them probably were not. If you know the development of the move of churches from the Pilgrim era, when they first were birthed on the eastern seaboard as they moved inland, that sometimes it was to reach the unreached, but quite often it simply became a place for those that flew that banner, knew they could come together for church. And so that's the reason in these small towns that sprang up, you had more than one. You'd have a Methodist church, you'd have a Presbyterian church, and a Baptist church, and a Catholic church. And so those became the points that if you're a Catholic, you went to the Catholic church. Or a Methodist, you went to the Methodist church. Or a Baptist, you went to the Baptist church. And so their focus was on simply providing a gathering place for, you know, birds of the same feather. And so I'm pretty sure that a lot of churches in this area were birthed from that era. Some were outward focused, but many were inwardly focused. But that was then, and this is now. So as I go into these churches that are, most of them are well under 100 attenders. Most of them are well under 50 attenders. Most of them would have to stretch it to say they have 25 in attendance, and sometimes it's as few as a dozen. Owning property that has no debt on it, not really able to pay a living wage for somebody to come in, and they're wanting somebody to come in and dance to the tune that they've always danced to. And so here's my quandary. I'm pretty sure I have an answer to this, but I'm interested in your input and feedback to this end. And that is because I consider myself something of a catalytic speaker. I go in to share in the hopes of engaging, in the hopes of igniting, in the hopes of inspiring a group of people to actually do something that's going to alter their circumstance. But I realize in examining the other speakers who have been invited in, as I go back and watch and listen to their sermons, that most aren't doing that. There are a number of hot buttons or issues, certainly in evangelical churches like Baptist churches, that anybody can go into, and if they're speaking on that text or that subject, then people like them. The David and Goliath story, people like that. The Jonah and the big fish story, people like that. If they want to talk about prayer and the power of prayer, people like that. If they want to speak on the second coming of Jesus, people like that. And so these guys come in and they share familiar tones and tunes and ideas about the victory and the power of faith and what God can do to change lives. And so they wrap up on high notes. And isn't it great that we serve a God that's powerful, who can do anything? And let's celebrate that fact. And they conclude the service and everybody's happy. The preacher, gets a little check to help him. And the people get to check the box that they did church and somebody preached the Bible to them. And they can simply go about their business until the following week. And I'm just, that's a suit or a pair of shoes that I have just never been comfortable wearing. Because if change is needed, then somebody needs to be confronted with the truth, the reality of their circumstance, and why they are in that boat, so to speak. And telling them something that's familiar, that they agree with, that they already know, is offering no component for making a difference. So going into last Sunday, this is what I struggled with. Now I only had a couple of days to prepare. I can do it on a 15-minute notice, but I like having time during the week to process, to think, to formulate my ideas, to structure the content and find the illustrations that are going to bring a point home. But on the short notice, I spent a couple of days struggling. So I took the passage or the text that I wanted to deal with and I asked myself the question, is it better to go in and just be honest with people? And that's not being crude or being rude. I have a sense of humor. I can't help it. I'm sarcastic. I can't help it. I want people to be encouraged by the tone and the tenor and the stories and those kind of, I want all of that, and so I aspire to do that. And so I got to wondering, well, do I need to sort of knock some of the edges off of that catalytic component of this? Make it a little bit more palatable to them so that they're not is likely to be offended by the experience. And maybe because I gain their favor in that moment, I will have more opportunities to come back and do that. So if I can move the needle by 1%, then I will take that 1%. And if I get enough percentage, over time, perhaps we can make a difference. And so that's what I sort of adopted that and went in. And it was a struggle for me through the whole of the experience. Now, I do know that because I've been doing this as long as I have, I am comfortable in my own skin. Standing before people, it doesn't bother me. The fear of public speaking doesn't bother me. I see it as a huge opportunity. But I struggled through that whole process of delivery. Now, I concluded on time. I made that promise to them. I got through the stuff. I told some stories. We dealt with the text, and we said amen. And they were nice about it. They gave me a little check to send me on my way. And my wife and I went to lunch. But I was uncomfortable through all of that, and thinking very likely, if they liked what they heard, they will invite me to go back. And so this has been my struggle and the question that I would have for you. Because in those scenarios, there are really two clear options. One is to go along to get along. And the other is to speak the truth in love, knowing that it may hurt. I know how to do both of those, but my sense of calling and purpose leads me to that speaking the truth in love and letting the chips fall where it may. So the question becomes, is it better off to go and tell people what they already know, knowing that they will affirm you in that, especially if you do it with wit and wisdom and you get them out on time for lunch, or to do something that causes people to pause and think? Do I tell people what they want to hear, Or do I tell people what they need to hear? I'm reasonably convinced that it has to be the second. I can't, at the risk of receiving no invitations to speak, because those that are destined for death are okay dying slowly. If you read about Hezekiah, king of Israel, and in his day when the Lord warned him that the kingdom was going to be taken, that Israel was going to go into captivity, the whole nation was going to go into captivity. And Hezekiah said, I'm okay as long as it's well in my day. While I'm alive, if life is good, I'm good with life. So here's where I came to, and I'm going to try to bring this for a landing. I'm not sure exactly how long we've been going yet. Time gets by from me quicker. That in respect to these opportunities in these churches, wherever they happen to be, they know the numbers because they record the numbers. They know how many people are in attendance. They know how much money is given. They know how many people they're burying. And they know how many people are not coming into their churches. And they're doing things the way they've always been done. My interest in the story of Jonathan and his armor bearer, my interest in the story of David and his slingshot, is really to that point that both of these young men didn't do what is normally done in combat. The MO of war for generations was one army on this side, one army on this side. And you come together in conflict in the middle, and the one with the most soldiers left standing when the blood has all been spilt is declared the winner. It was about shields and swords and suits of armor. In Jonathan's case, it wasn't about any of those things. He may have had some armor on. He only had one sword. His armor bearer didn't have anything except to follow along with him. His was a completely unorthodox, and frankly, it was an unauthorized approach. And yet it worked. David's the very same thing. Was when he told Saul, I'll do this, Saul says, when I look at you and I look at Goliath, I'm going, not a snowball's chance, and you know where. And David said, don't worry. I've taken out a bear, I've taken out a lion. Goliath is just one more two-legged creature to take down. And Saul said, okay, well here, take my armor. And David, before he can say anything, he's got a bunch of armor bearers, valets, whatever they are out there, and they're strapping, iron on him from foot to head with a shield and a helmet and a sword. What we're told about Saul is he was a big man. He stood out when God anointed him as king. He was head and shoulders tall above everyone else. And I don't get an impression anywhere in Scripture that describes David. He's always described as a young shepherd boy until he became king. Nothing conspicuous about what he looked like, other than apparently he was handsome because the girls oohed and awed over him. But he said to Saul, this ain't going to work. This is not my thing. Let me do my thing. And Saul said, fine, it's your head. We know the story. David made his way out, stopped someplace, picked up a few little rocks, walked out in the middle of that valley, and Goliath cursed him, cursed Israel, cursed Israel's God. Made fun of this little boy coming out to fight the battle. And it's like David says, oh, you think that's funny? Watch this. It said David ran at him. Whop! Let that stone fly out of that sling, and he nailed Goliath right in his forehead. Boom! Splat. And to leave nothing to chance, David went over and grabbed that giant's sword, pulled it out, whack, chopped his head off. But in both the cases of these young men, they did what was unorthodox. So I think about struggling churches, and the message they need to hear is that if what you're doing and what you have done is not working, why do you insist on keep doing it? And I want to be the one to go in and have a loving and friendly conversation with them to help them embrace that reality. And to say, have you ever considered the fact that who God would bring in here is going to do it in a way that you've never seen it done before? But that's okay. It's not with God to save by many or by few. That's what Jonathan said. And that can be the difference maker. So my question to those of you who are listening to this, watching this, many of you know me from my years in serving. Many of you know me across, when I posted that on Tuesday this week is when I took Sarah to the hospital to drop her off for the outpatient thing for surgery, and went out and found a place to read, and 4 hours later I went in and picked her up and took her home. That when I posted about her having kidney stones and getting unstoned, while many of the people I've known during their earlier life, their wayward years, spent their time getting stoned. When I posted that, just so people could know and respond accordingly, that I was encouraged by the spectrum of people that responded to that. There is Vicky that I knew before God called me to preach. She was there when that took place. That's been almost 50 years ago. She's never even met my wife, and yet we've become friends on Facebook. So that was from one church. There are people from the last church that I served in Texas, who have logged on and offered their words of encouragement and prayer. There are people from Maryland that have done that, people from South Carolina that have done that. It's people across almost 5 decades of ministry responding to that. So that's my, and I know there's others that don't respond. There are people in Canada that watch this. There are people perhaps in Montana that watch it. There's somebody in the Philippines that watches this, and people in Texas and California and other places. It's just amazing the breadth of humanity. So it's that pool that I would like to hear your thoughts. Some of you are pastors as well. Roy there in Katy, Texas, who's always very affirming in his response to me. Or there's Mike in Minnesota in retirement, up there keeping the mosquitoes and the snowmen warm. That men who have been in the trenches, or men that are in the trenches, and some of you, you're just simply people who love the Lord and have been a part of our story at some point. I'd really value your opinion. If you were in a dead and dying church, you love the people, you didn't want to go someplace else, and somebody was going to come in that might offer some insight that would change things, what would you propose that person do? With all of the variables about being a good communicator, watching the time, the stories you tell, your body language, your facial gestures, your tone of voice. So, all those kind of things being what they ought to be. The content, though, being a message that says, if you don't do something different, you're dead. So there you have it. I want to hear from you. Talk it over and let me know what you think. I'm convinced that I need to do what's just, it's natural for me to do. I'm okay saying to the guy, dude, your fly's open. Or to the lady, you got spinach in your teeth. Or you get the point. And hopefully somewhere along the way to be able to laugh about what has been and what God has done through people like us. So thank you for tuning in. We're now in the month of December. We're wrapping up the year in more ways than one. A word of thank you to those who have financially supported the ministry that's enabled me to travel, to go and do these interviews. I have some more interviews lined up to do that I need to book even now, to buy the equipment. I'm thinking of other things we can do in terms of ministry expression with those resources. So I want to thank you. If some of you intend to be a part of this, while we know that the giving season ends in December for this year, we issue a letter acknowledging the contribution you've made. So if you file a long form in your taxes, you can submit that. We're a 501c3 organization. So let me hear from you. If you're old school, as some are, and you simply want to drop a check in the mail, you can make it out to Church Rebirth Ministries Incorporated and send it to this mailing address. Thank you for the privilege, the time, the honor of being able to sit in this chair or go into these churches and share with you what takes place there. In the meantime, look forward to hearing from you. God bless you. I'll be back next week.